Happy Wednesday. It is good to be back together again today as we continue to dig into the book of Genesis. We are getting closer to the end here. We are farther in the story. And as we left off last week, remember, we were at the point where Jacob had to leave home and travel to his mother's family's land, which actually is where Abraham originally came from, Haran in Ur. So Jacob has left, and he's left in shame. But remember, at the end of chapter 28, Jacob had an encounter with God. And I think that encounter that he has with God really kind of sets the tone for everything that's going to happen up until now, or from now on. Up until this point, Jacob's relationship with God has been kind of maybe a head relationship. Like, he knew who God was, of course, because we can assume that he grew up in a family of faith with parents who were faithful. But I don't think that Jacob had that sense of heart relationship with God. And his encounter with God at Bethel with the ladder really kind of changes that for him. And like I said, that will impact his story as things go forward here. So today we're going to be looking at chapters 29 through 31 of Genesis. And we're going to see here in these chapters the ongoing education and transformation of Jacob, who will eventually become the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. All right, so beginning in chapter 29, Jacob arrives in the land of his family. And he arrives in this area, we're told, and he goes to a well. Now, certainly Jacob probably is familiar with the story of his mother, Rebecca, and how Rebecca was kind of found at the well here. And so wells are significant here. This notion of water and things happening around water and living water, so to speak, water that's coming up from the earth and providing nourishment for people. That is important. So he gets there, and he's encountering some shepherds. It says in verse 4, Jacob asked the shepherds, "My brothers, where are you from?" "We're from Haran," they replied. He said to them, "Do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson?" "Yes, we know him," they answered. Then Jacob asked them, "Is he well?" "Yes, he is," they said, "and here comes his daughter Rachel with the sheep." All right, remember, Laban is Rebekah's brother. So Jacob is inquiring after family here, and lo and behold, yeah, we know him. And by the way, here comes his daughter. And so Jacob is excited to find a family member, and he greets Rachel exuberantly. One note that I kind of want to make here, verse 11 says, Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. Don't mistake this kiss here as anything romantic. He's just thrilled, and it's kind of a form of greeting. And of course, then later he gets that same kind of greeting from Laban. And so he says, I'm your cousin. So she runs and gets her dad. And Laban comes running out to meet his nephew and embraces him and kisses him and brings him to his home. And it's important now, this little piece of information that here's what I've enjoyed about doing these studies. It's caused me to go in depth and find some things that maybe I just hadn't noticed before. So I want to note here in at the end of verse 13, Laban comes. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his home. And there Jacob told him all these things. All what things? Well, I'm guessing that given what happens after this, what Jacob told him was everything that led him to this point. It's kind of like wiry here. And so Jacob gives him the whole nasty story. And we see this almost kind of disappointment maybe play out in Laban's response to Jacob. Then from now on, Laban is expecting, I think, great wealth, like what came when Rebecca was taken, so to speak, to be married to Isaac. And I think Laban is kind of expecting the same kind of thing, but that's not what he gets. He finds out that he has a nephew who, yeah, even though he has the blessing and the birthright on the oldest child, that he came across that or came by that dishonestly and has in essence been kind of sent off in shame and is kind of running and hiding. We're going to see now that the deceiver, Jacob's been guilty of doing a lot of deceiving and kind of cheating. Remember, his name means one who deceives, or the cheater. He is now going to become the deceived as we will move forward in this story. I am overwhelmed when I read the story now that's coming next in the remainder of chapter 29 and 30, although it's probably a familiar story for most of us. I'm overwhelmed as I read it this time, and it's happened to me before, and I pick up different things every time I read it. But every time I read this story, I am overwhelmed at how sad this situation is and how much pain is involved here. All right, so Jacob is invited to stay, and he's stayed there for a month, and Laban comes to him and says, look, I want to pay you for the work that you're doing for me. And then we hear that Laban had two daughters. Of course, one we already knew, Rachel. The older one was Leah, and the younger one was Rachel. We're kind of given a little description here. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel was lovely in form and beautiful. Leah, probably weak eyes. I don't know. There are some translations that say that she has delicate eyes or that she is doe-eyed. I think kind of this is a delicate and maybe the expression of that time to say that Leah was maybe just kind of homely. She wasn't the most attractive girl on the block, especially in comparison with her sister Rachel. Rachel was lovely in form, we're told, and beautiful. And then we're told in verse 18, Jacob was in love with Rachel. And so he says, I'll work for you for 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel. Here's where the first deception takes place. Laban's response is, well, okay, better you than any other guy. So you can stay here with me. And so Jacob works for 7 years to get Rachel. But we're told it seemed like only a few days to him because he was so in love with her. And so 7 years goes by. Jacob says to Laban, okay, time's up. I want my wife. And the wedding happens. And lo and behold, in the process of this wedding, and the custom of this is that the bride would be heavily veiled, and there's this large banquet and celebration and everything that happens. But essentially what happens is Jacob doesn't find out until the next morning that he didn't marry Rachel. He married Leah. And boy, the tables have turned on him, haven't they? Jacob, whose father thought that he was blessing Esau, instead blessed the younger son. Now Jacob has kind of the tables turned on him. The same thing kind of happens to him. He has been deceived. He thought he was marrying the younger daughter, but instead he married the older daughter. And the explanation that Laban gives is that it's, look, we're in a place where it's not our custom to give the younger daughter before the older one. And he kind of withheld that information from Jacob to begin with. It's interesting here that sin has a way of coming back to bite us, so to speak. What Jacob has done to his father essentially gets done to him. There's an expression that from where I come from, what goes around comes around. I think what goes around came around to Jacob. And so now he's ended up with 2 wives. And he also has, each of those wives has a servant. And so then we are, and the only reason that he is given Rachel then is because he agrees to work for Laban for another 7 years. So essentially, the dowry price, the price for those brides, is 14 years of labor. Remember, Jacob doesn't have any of his wealth. He doesn't have anything that he could pay the dowry price with. And so he pays this off by working for 7 years labor for each. All right. And then we go into, starting in verse 31 here, this litany of the children that happens, that Jacob ends up having. I think it's important, that kind of sets the tone here for what's going to happen. In verse 30, it says, Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. My heart just breaks for Leah here when I read this, and as I continue to move through this story. So then we go into verse 31, and it's interesting. God, I think, also takes pity on this situation and sees what's happening here. And it says, we're told, when the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. 3rd generation now that we have, where we have a woman who is barren. Remember, Sarah was barren, Rebecca was barren for a while, and now Jacob's love, Rachel, is barren. And it's also interesting to see the reaction of each of the patriarchs to this situation of barrenness. Abraham vacillates back and forth between faithfulness and then the whole incident with Hagar, trying to fix it by himself. And Isaac then, on the other hand, prays. He's patient and he prays and he trusts God, and Rebecca is able to have a child. Jacob kind of falls back into the same kind of pattern as Abraham, although I don't think Jacob really has much of a role in this. I think Jacob just kind of is going along for the ride here. It seems like Leah and Rachel are the 2 people who are in control of this barrenness situation, and we're gonna see that play out. So here we get this kind of long story, and of how the children of Jacob all end up kind of happening, the 12 tribes, or the 12 sons of Jacob, who will eventually become the 12 tribes of Israel. And so I just I'm not going to go through all of this in verse by verse or anything like that. I will leave you to do that yourself. but I'm just going to kind of point out and list here kind of the order. So this happens, there's kind of this battle that goes on back and forth between Rachel and Leah on the being valuable in giving Jacob sons. And Leah's able to have kids for a while, and then all of a sudden she can't. And Rachel's mad about this, and Rachel can't have children, and so she gives her servant to Jacob, kind of like Sarah did with Hagar. And then she has some kids, and then Leah responds back by giving her servant, and back and forth and back and forth. Here is how it all plays out. Leah has the first 4 sons. She gives birth to Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Interestingly enough, Levi is the son from whom the priestly line comes, the Levites, and Judah is the son from whom the kingly line comes. And Jesus, in fact, himself will be a descendant from the line of Judah. All right, so that's the first 4 boys. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. They're all children of Leah. All right, child number 5 then is from Rachel's servant, child number 5 and child number 6, Dan and Naphtali. They are through Rachel's servant Bilhah. All right, so you see, Leah has 4, Rachel gets mad, she gives him kind of legally, technically and stuff, 2 with Bilhah. Leah is like, okay, well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So she gives her servant, Zilpah, to Jacob. And then Gad and Asher, number 7 and 8, are born. And then all of a sudden, we get this kind of little interlude here. And this is one of the things that I think is puzzling and pitiful at the same time. After Asher is born, neither Rachel or Leah can have children. So Leah's oldest son, Reuben, goes out and he finds some mandrakes. And mandrakes are called, one of their nicknames is love apples. They are supposed to be kind of like good luck for fertility and to make an aphrodisiac kind of thing. I was having trouble finding up the word. So Rachel sees this and she goes to Leah and she says, give me some of your son's mandrakes. And Leah responds to her, which is kind of interesting here. I'm in verse 15. Leah said to her, wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you take my son's mandrakes too? Very well, Rachel said. He can sleep with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes. So, when Jacob came in from the fields that evening, Leah went out to meet him. You must sleep with me, she said. I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he slept with her that night. I find this curious and, like I say, pitiful at the same time. So this is the level to which these 2 sisters have sunk, that they are bartering for the attentions of this man using a couple of mandrakes. It's incredibly sad. I think that we need to just make a little side note here talking about polygamy. Jacob is the first one. Although Esau has had multiple wives, it's clear that that displeases Isaac and Rebekah. And there have been others throughout Scripture, but it's not been the norm. And this is the first time that we see that it's really kind of the norm, that there are, here we have two wives and two concubines, and are giving birth to all these children. And I think that we need to note here about polygamy. Polygamy is not God's original intent. God's original intent was that this marriage relationship would be between one man and one woman, that it was sacred. And of course, like everything else that God has created, we human beings have kind of corrupted this. The other thing I think that we should note is that this was a common practice in the culture at the time. And some of it was just for practical matters because the mortality rate for infants was high. And so you would have multiple wives to have multiple children so that you could guarantee multiple offspring to carry on your name. I think it's important for us to note that just because it's socially acceptable doesn't mean that it's wise and doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do. However, we also know God takes all things and works them together for good. His purposes will be fulfilled no matter how we as human beings mess things up. So God's going to take this and turn it into something good. All right, so after the mandrake incident, then what happens is then we are told in verse 17, God listened to Leah, and she became pregnant and bore Jacob a fifth son. All right, so Rachel has essentially sold Jacob for mandrakes, which she is hoping will help her get pregnant. That doesn't work. Leah ends up getting pregnant. All right, so now we're up to children number 9 and 10. And this is Issachar and Zebulun. So Leah has had 6 sons. Zilpah has had 2. Bilhah has had 2. And then we're told, it's just kind of like stuck in here, but it will figure later into the story. We're told in verse 21, sometime later she, that means Leah, gave birth to a daughter and named her Dinah. If you have ever read the book, The Red Tent, it is kind of this story, and it really focuses on this person of Dinah. I'll just leave that to you if you would like to read it. All right, verse 22. Then God remembered Rachel, and he listened to her and opened her womb. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son. All right, Joseph, son number 11. All right, so now here are 11 of the 12. And of course, then we know, and we'll talk about it more later, but there will be another son that will come to make that 12. All right. So now here we are at in the middle of chapter 30, and we have this kind of interesting little interlude here of things that go on with the sheep and the goats and things like that. And there is some kind of talking with Laban. Laban is really kind of turning out to be kind of a nasty man. But Laban knows that, and Jacob reminds him, after Rachel gives birth to Joseph, Jacob goes to Laban and he says, let me go on my way so I can go back to my homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you. All right, so Jacob has paid the dowry for these women, and but it's interesting because he can't leave unless he has the consent and permission. That was the kind of the code of the law of that time. You had to have the consent and permission of not only the women but of their father as well. But Laban doesn't want him to go. He's like, no, stay. And then he says in verse 27, it kind of gives us a clue for what kind of person Laban is. He says, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages and I will pay you. So it's clear, we get this little hint here that Laban is not a worshiper of the one true God alone. He's learned by divination, and that God is with Jacob, and so Jacob agrees to work, and they agree on this whole way to divide the herds and things like that. But Laban is even honest and dishonest with him there. They agree that Jacob is going to take the spotted or speckled sheep. Every dark colored or spotted or speckled. That's what Jacob is going to take. And they agree on that. But then Laban, in verse 35, we're told that same day Laban removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats, and all the dark colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. So he had just agreed with Jacob to let him have these, and they kind of goes behind his back and like calls the herd, so to speak, so that Jacob doesn't get as much. But Jacob does this trick with branches and stuff like that, and I can't quite figure all of that out. It's clear that God has his hand in some of this. Despite what Laban is doing, God is finding a way to make Jacob prosperous and successful. All right, now we are in chapter 31, and we are seeing that things are starting to sour in this relationship here. Verse 1, Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father. And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. All right, so things are, there's trouble right here in River City. And so this time it is the Lord who comes to Jacob and tells him it's time to go. We see this in verse 3. The Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. So this time God has decided, yeah, it's time for you to get out of Dodge. It's time for you to leave. Jacob talks to Rachel and Leah about this. Remember, I said he couldn't leave with everybody unless the wives and stuff agreed to go. So the wives, he talks to both of them, both Rachel and Leah, and we see that they agree on this. They are united in this. He says in verse 7, your father has cheated me by changing my wages 10 times. However, God has not allowed him to harm me. And so then he goes on to tell them, he says, God came to me, the one true God, Yahweh, came to me and says, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and go back to your native land. And then in verse 14, we're told, Rachel and Leah reply, look, we have nothing here. We don't have any share in the inheritance because we're women. And then they go on to make this kind of interesting statement here about their father. In verse 15, does he not regard us as foreigners? Where does that come from? Is that because they're married to Jacob? Not only has he sold us, but he has used up what was paid for us. So they recognize that their father is taking advantage of the situation here and does not have their best interests at heart. And so they tell him, do whatever your God or whatever God has told you. So they leave Jacob and his wives and their servants and all of their children. And they plan to go back to where Isaac is and into the land of Canaan. But then we're given this kind of little odd thing here in verse 19. When Laban had gone to shear his sheep, so he's off doing this job, which is probably pretty lengthy, Rachel stole her father's household gods. Moreover, Jacob deceived Laban by not telling him he was running away. So not only did they sneak off, but Rachel has done something here that Jacob has no knowledge about. And I kind of don't think that anybody else does. She steals the household gods. Why does she do that? We're not told. I think there might be a couple of reasons here. I don't think that it's that Rachel thinks that they are of any power or any value, at least to her and to Jacob, because Jacob's made it pretty clear that he only worships one God. Rachel, however, recognizes that these are important to her dad. And so she also knows that maybe he practices like some sort of divination. And I think that kind of scares her and makes her a little bit uncertain. And so she takes away this kind of like peace that Laban has. So she's trying to kind of tip the scales in their favor, so to speak. All right, so they're fleeing. Laban finds out, and Laban is after Jacob for 7 days, and he finally catches up with him. But then we are told in verse 24, God came to Laban in a dream at night and said to him, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. All right, so here we see kind of a warning from God. And in verse 29, then Laban confronts Jacob. He's like, look, I've got the power to harm you. I'm kind of the boss of you right now. But I want you to know I'm sparing you. I'm sparing your life, essentially, because God said, your God came to me and said not to do anything. But then he goes on and he says, but why did you steal my gods? Well, Jacob clearly knows nothing about that the gods have been taken. And he gets mad. He's like, there's nothing of yours here, man. And you are welcome to search the entire camp and do this. And if anybody's taken anything that belongs to you, then they should be put to death. And we're told at the end of verse 32, Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the gods. So here now, Rachel is potentially in danger, and Jacob doesn't even realize it. And so Laban goes searching through everybody's tent. Rachel gets pretty clever. She hides the gods in her camel's like saddlebag, and she sits on it. And then she tells him, she's like, I can't get up because I've got my period, essentially, which means she's unclean. And so he's like, fine, and lets her go. And all of that. So off they go. But at the end of this here, Jacob finally grows a pair, so to speak. Jacob, I think, has really kind of come into his own. Jacob has turned from the deceiver. he's gone through this transformation. He was the deceiver, the cheater, and then he became like the cheated, the deceived, and kind of the victim, the one who was bought and sold for mandrakes. And now he has been transformed into a leader. He has come into his own, so to speak, and he stands up for himself and for his wives and his children. And he basically says, I'm doing what's best for my family. He goes on, I've been working for you for 20 years. You've just been taking advantage of me. You keep changing the wages. You keep changing the rules and everything. And then in verse 42, he says, but God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you. So Jacob finally is calling Laban to task on this. He's calling him out. His true colors are now exposed, his greed and his dishonesty. Laban tries to counter this. He tries to see if he can get Jacob to back down again. Verse 43, the women are my daughters, the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks. All you see is mine. But Laban knows that that is not true. And he knows that it will not be seen that way. He has finally been exposed, and he has been held accountable by God. So then he kind of reverses course and agrees to make an agreement with Jacob. It's not a peace treaty of, so to speak. It's kind of a pole or a pile of rocks that they set up. And it basically just means, look, you go your way, I'm going to go my way, and we're going to be done with each other. But this also says, even though we're not together, God's going to be watching you. That's what they're kind of saying to each other. God is a witness between you and me. And so that's how they end up then kind of going their separate ways. It's kind of a sad ending here to something that could have been very joyous, because remember, Laban is Jacob's uncle. He's his mother, Rebekah's brother. It's unfortunate that it has ended this way. The chapter ends then, verse 55, early the next morning, Laban kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then he left and returned home. So Jacob and his family are free to go and to go on their way. And we'll pick up that part of the story next week, because things are going to get interesting again, because he's going back home. So thank you for joining today. I'm glad to have you with us or with me. Let's close our time together in prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for the gift of this day. We thank you for the gift of your word and for the many little treasures and nuggets that we have in this. Thank you for giving us the lesson today, Lord, that sometimes, even though our sin can come back to bite us, you can turn that around and use it for our good. Sometimes it's part of the painful process of transformation, making us into the people that you want us to be, the people that you will do great things through. Lord, I ask your blessing on all of us now as we go our ways through this next week. I ask thee prosper the work of our hands. Help us to share the gospel, the good news, things that people are so desperate to hear. With all those we come in contact with, give us the words that we need to do so. I ask for your blessing, and humbly, in the name of Jesus, our Lord and Savior. Amen. Thanks for being with me. It was really good to have this time together with you today. I'll see you next week.